Well, hello there. This is the third part of a series that we have been doing on an issue called The Paradox of Horror. So if you haven't seen the first two videos, I highly recommend checking them out first. Otherwise, this video is going to seem kind of weird. Be like starting off with Lord of the Rings, Return of the King instead of the Fellowship of the Ring. Like, why? So in the first two videos, I unpacked what exactly the paradox of horror is, and I summarized a kind of disagreement between two authors and philosophers about that paradox, Gout and Noel Carroll. And in the first video, we asked the question, why do we enjoy horror films when they produce negative emotions in us, things like fear and disgust? Why do we seemingly enjoy the unenjoyable when it comes to horror? So this is sort of a debate in the world of philosophical aesthetics. Aesthetics. And yes, I know that's actually a thing. There's like a sub-branch of philosophy, specifically for aesthetics. Anyway, we ended the last video by unpacking Dr. Gout's view that it's possible to actually enjoy negative emotions, even though they're negative. And he offered a couple justifications that we unpacked. However, there's another theory that aims to explain the paradox of horror, and that's called the Control Thesis. And the Control Thesis essentially goes like this. It says that it's the act of being in control of the situation that largely explains why we enjoy these negative emotions. So for example, I used an analogy in a previous video about being face-to-face with a lion, but behind plexiglass. We're in control of that situation, so when the lion charges at you and you fly backwards and you land on your ass, we laugh it off and turn it into a viral YouTube video, even though it's kind of terrifying. And since horror is fiction, since it's behind the plexiglass, as it were, it's easy for us to focus that control because there are no consequences for the viewer. Like, you don't accrue any negative penalty in virtue of those negative emotions the moment you throw away your popcorn and leave the movie theater. The Control Thesis also says that should things get out of hand, should the violence or fear or suffering become too extreme for you, there's a sense of loss of control, and then those negative emotions are no longer enjoyed. So a good example of this for me was the movie Bone Tomahawk with Kurt Russell. If you haven't seen it, it's kind of a weird horror western. It's actually a pretty decent movie, but there is a particular scene, torture scene, towards the end of the movie that is a bit unexpected. It comes out of left field, and it's brutally graphic and disgusting. In fact, for me, it was legitimately so bad that it was the first time in my life I had to stop watching a movie. And I stopped, I turned it off, I went outside, I got some fresh air, did a couple things, came back in and finished the film. And that sort of thing has never happened to me before, and I've seen a Serbian film. So we could say my sense of control, of being a viewer of fiction, was overruled, as it were. Overruled by this unexpected level of graphic violence. So much so that I couldn't even continue enjoying what I knew was fiction. So I wasn't feeling like I was in control anymore as the viewer. So that's how the theory goes. Now, Dr. Gout rejects this outright. He denies the control theory. In fact, he just doesn't think control is even linked to the idea of negative emotions. So for one, he argues that people are variable. Not everyone's enjoyment of those negative emotions can be explained simply by the idea of control, like it's too simple of an answer. Additionally, people can actually dislike the negative emotions that they're in control of. Think about that. So if we were to swing back around to my Bone Tomahawk example, Dr. Gout would probably say that it's the case that I'm still in control during that scene. That is, I can focus my attention on the torture, or I can move it somewhere else if I want to. So I'm in control, I just don't like what I'm experiencing. So in other words, people can dislike the negative emotions they're in control of. And here's what's wild. The flip of that is also true. That is, people can enjoy these negative elements of horror films precisely because they're unable to be controlled. These are probably the crazies who like the Saw and Hostel films. They go in large part because of the spectacle of violence. What gruesome trap is next? Will that person's head explode? For some, the thrill is the lack of control and wanting that over-the-top inexpectancy of the gruesome. These are kind of like the spank me harder daddy people of the horror world. Ugh. And I actually have my own theory about how you can pinpoint these sorts of people. Or really, I guess I should say, how you can pinpoint people who aren't like this. And that's the movie trailer. Like, if a person has to see the trailer before they'll sign off on going to see a horror film, then it seems like it's all about the control of those negative emotions. My wife is like this. She refuses to go to a horror movie with me unless she watches the trailer first. Not to see if she thinks the movie will be good or bad, but to see if it's manageable. In one of our early dates in 2004, God, I'm old, I made the mistake of watching Jeepers Creepers with her. She had never seen it. I thought it would be a good idea for some reason, and it's 14 years later, and I still get threatened with divorce every time the name of that movie is brought up. And I am not joking. It just scared her to death, that movie. And from that point on, she just has to watch the trailer before she will go into a horror film, not just with me, but ever. But anyway, back to Dr. Gout. Now, we know that Dr. Gout buys into the idea that people just enjoy negative emotions. But he goes on to argue that different people associate different emotions differently. Wow, that's kind of a mindfuck. So in other words, like take tension, the emotion of feeling tense, being tense or anxious in a horror film. I love that. To me, that is a wonderful experience that I enjoy when I watch a horror film. To my wife, it's awful. It's just absolutely awful. So Dr. Gout would argue that people associate emotions differently. Furthermore, and this is the most important part, he introduces the idea of evaluation into the equation when it comes to emotion. And this is really important because it explains, at least on his view, the mechanism for how we can enjoy negative emotions. So Dr. Gout says they're less about feelings and more about appraisal. So less down here, more up here. Emotions, when they're unpacked, are more about the brain than the heart. They're evaluations. So the emotion may not be negative, but the evaluation can be. See, we're so used to tying negative emotions to unpleasant sensations that the idea of enjoying them seems paradoxical. But to Dr. Gout, they're really not. They're just atypical situations where they can be enjoyed, i.e. horror films. This again is like the roller coaster rider who enjoys the fear and the danger involved in the ride. But notice what follows from this. It's only atypical for a person to enjoy negative emotions if what's typical for people is the connection of negative emotions and unpleasantness. So here's the rub. If you enjoy horror films, you're just atypical. You're fucking weird. But you already knew that, and so did I. So pat yourself on the back and embrace what you know you've always been. Thanks for watching.